Hello and welcome to this simulation. I want to try to walk you through the first part of the simulation so that you have a basic understanding of what this simulation is trying to accomplish. To start, the assumption of this simulation is that you are both a government and you run an energy company. You can think of it like a state-owned energy company. And in your role as both a government and a state-owned energy company, you have some goals. You have to stay in office as a member of what is going to start off as a democracy and can be changed to other systems of government if you're creative enough. And also you have to provide power or energy to the people that you represent and do so in a way that turns a profit. This may not be a realistic model based on governments and energy systems that exist in the real world, but it is the model that we're going to start off with. The reason I built this model was as an instructional tool. And what I was trying to help people understand, or students specifically, is that in our modern society, we use a lot of energy. And that energy allows us to maintain a high standard of living. And we would like to continue to have that high standard of living and probably have access to all of that energy. We also need to consider how we can produce energy and maintain a high standard of living while reducing the negative impacts on the environment. Because this simulation places you in the role of the government, you need to maintain a stable government. And finally, you also have to be able to produce a stable energy supply. The simulation is built on 6 goals. There are 3 goals that are short-term goals, and there are 3 goals that are long-term goals. Let's take a look at the short-term goals in this video. The short-term goals that you have to meet as a government and an energy producer are: you have to meet the energy demand, and that's illustrated in this box right here. What's given here is the amount of energy that you are supplying, and the units are arbitrary. So you can think about a percentage if you want, but that's going to not work next round. So just let's think about that there are 100 units of energy that your population demands, and your current energy infrastructure is only able to produce 97 of those units of energy. This red X right here means that you are not currently meeting that goal, and you are deficient 3 units of energy. You are also given a budget. You have to stay within that budget. The budget units are billions of dollars, and so you have $12 billion that you can spend. Currently, you have spent 0 of those $12 billion, so good job. You've not gone over budget, and you have $12 billion left. Finally, as a government, and a democratically elected government, you have to maintain an approval rating greater than 45%. There are some factors that influence that approval rating. Currently, you are above that approval rating. So 45.05 means that you have this 0.05% of goodwill that exceeds the minimum that you need in order to stay in office. Let's start off now by addressing this energy shortfall, and let's meet our short-term goals. You have a variety of choices that I'm going to give to you during the course of this simulation, but for this one, the only choices that you can make are shown in the yellow boxes. You can choose a name for your country or your group, whatever you want. I'm just going to type in El Sarge, that will be me. And the other options that I'm allowing you to make in this particular activity is you get to decide how many new nuclear plants you're going to build, or how many fossil fuel plants you're going to build, or how many new renewable energy plants you're going to build. And these are the yellow boxes here. Again, the only places that you can enter information in this spreadsheet are the yellow boxes. If you try to enter data or type in the other boxes, you'll actually break the programming, and you need to re-download the spreadsheet or try to fix the mistake that you've made. So just stick to the yellow boxes. Those are the ones that are the control switches that you have access to. I have simplified this simulation by dividing up energy power plants into 3 different types: nuclear energy, fossil fuel energy, and renewable energy. And building these energy power plants has different effects. You, as a government entity, inherited an existing energy infrastructure. So this supply, the 97 units of energy that you are currently able to supply, is because of the energy that your country or region, or however you want to think about the people that you govern, they already have some power plants. In fact, that's listed here, and currently in the model that I'm using, the simulation, every group should start off with the same energy portfolio or the same types of power plants. You have 18 nuclear power facilities, you have 100 fossil fuel power facilities, and you have 110 renewable energy power facilities. Nuclear power plants are pretty well defined, they're pretty consistent, they all look about the same, they have big concrete structures with nuclear control rods. Fossil fuel plants come typically as natural gas or coal. We're not going to make it a distinction in this particular activity. You just have 100 of them, whatever they are. Renewable energy plants are much more varied. These can be solar energy farms or wind turbines or hydroelectric power facilities, or you can even have biofuel burners where you can burn grass in order to produce the energy that you need to generate electricity. And so this is not a very precise aspect of the simulation, but it's the way the simulation is. So you have 18 nuclear power plants, 100 fossil fuel plants, and 140 renewable energy plants. Those plants actually don't all produce an equivalent amount of energy. For example, a nuclear power facility is going to produce a lot more energy than a single wind turbine. And so over here is shown the percentage of the energy and where it's coming from. So 18.56% of your 97 units of energy are coming from these 18 nuclear power plants. 67.01% of your energy is coming from fossil fuel, and 14.43% of your energy is coming from renewable. As this simulation progresses, you are going to be able to modify both the number of each of these types of plants, and you can turn them up or tear them out. Or you can also start to modify the percentages, and that will be a tutorial that you'll see later on. For now, the only option you have is whether or not you want to build new power plants, and we have to because we're not meeting our energy demand. So let's just see what happens if we build a single nuclear power plant. So I'm going to type a 1 in this box and hit enter, and you should see the numbers change. Let's evaluate the impact of having built that one nuclear power plant, and you can start to actually see what impact, how the programming works on the back end. So building one nuclear power plant caused your supply to go from 97 to 98. This means that each nuclear power facility produces 1 unit of energy. I can actually meet my full demand by building 3 nuclear power plants, and now I've met my demand. If you remember, we started off being 3 units of energy short, and so if I build 3 nuclear power plants, now I am producing enough energy. The problem is that that pushes me over budget and also drops my approval rating down below the bare minimum of 45%. So I have not managed to meet my short-term goals. So let's go back and put that 1 energy power plant in, the 1 nuclear power plant. So based on just typing in a 1 and seeing how it impacts your supply and demand, you should be able to see that nuclear energy produces 1 unit of energy. The cost of building that nuclear energy power plant in this simulation is $4.5 billion. So we started off with 12. That was your budget that you were given for this particular round. You just spent 4.5 billion of that, and you still have 7.5 billion left over. The impact that it has on public approval is actually stated right here. And this number is arbitrary. And so it may not be or may not represent the reality of anywhere on the planet. But for the sake of the simulation, I just set public approval of nuclear power plants at 35%. So if you have 18 nuclear power plants and the public only 35% of the public approves, then building a 19th nuclear power plant, now we're at 19, is actually going to cause public opinion to shift downward. And so we are constrained by what the public will allow us to do. And if you look at the approval ratings, currently in the simulation, the public has a low approval rating of nuclear power and a low approval rating of renewable power. But they like fossil fuel power. It's what they know. You are going to have the opportunity to change and shift almost every numerical parameter within this spreadsheet, including the approval, and we'll talk about that in a subsequent tutorial. So we've played around with nuclear power plants a little bit, and hopefully you are convinced that there is no number of nuclear power plants that you can build that will satisfy all three of your short-term goals. If we build one, then our approval is too low and our supply is too low. If we build two, then still approval and supply. Three, well, we met our demand, but now we've gone over budget. So that doesn't mean we can't build nuclear power plants. It definitely doesn't mean we can't ever build them. But for the sake of this particular round, it's going to be, we just have to do something else. So let's come down here and take a look at fossil fuel plants. If I build a single fossil fuel plant, you'll notice three things. Right? First of all, our supply went up. It did not go up by 1. So a fossil fuel plant only produces an additional 0.65 units of energy. The budget, the cost of a fossil fuel plant is $1 billion. So I can build quite a few of these before I go over budget. And my public approval actually went up. Given the parameter that I'm starting with, where 50% of the public approves of fossil fuel plants, that means that if I were to build an infinite number of fossil fuel plants, then my public approval would eventually go to 50%. So I can cause public approval currently to go up by building fossil fuel plants, and it can go down if I build other types of power plants. So let's see if I can build, let's try building 4 of these. Still have not yet met my demand, so let's build a 5th. Okay. You can just submit this as your number of fossil fuel plants and you will have met your short-term goals. We're going to talk about why meeting your short-term goals with 5 fossil fuel plants may present other problems when we get over here to the long-term goals. But for the sake of short-term goals, all 3 green check marks is a good thing. We've met our short-term goals. This will work. Now let's consider what happens if you vary the types. So let's go back and build 1 nuclear power plant and 5 fossil fuel power plants, and I've also now met my short-term goals. But I've done something wasteful. My supply is in excess of my demand by 1.25 units. This is energy that I'm not selling as a power company that does me no good. So I am producing too much energy. Generally speaking, you want to keep your supply as close to your demand as possible. So let's trim out one of my fossil fuel plants. If I cut out 2 fossil fuel plants, then I have not yet met my demand. So I can build 1 nuclear and 4 fossil fuel plants, and that will work. Fractional fossil fuel plants are not allowed for reasons that I hope are obvious to you. It's hard to build a half of a fossil fuel plant and have it be functional. You might ask, well, what if we build a smaller fossil fuel plant? That's actually not an option that's currently built into the simulation. So let's try now renewable energy. So we'll cut out our fossil fuel and our nuclear plants and go down here and let's drop in a single renewable energy plant. What you'll notice is that renewable energy plants produce the least amount of energy, so we only went up by 1/10 of a unit, but they're also the cheapest, and we only spent this would be $200 million on our renewable energy power plant. Public approval did drop a little bit. The number of nuclear power plants that you have to build is usually a big number. You end up putting a lot of these in order to get your energy up. And so we can build 30 of these. We have the budget to do that, but our public approval dipped. And so because of the public approval problems associated with renewable energy plants at this point in the simulation, you're going to have trouble building very many of these. So let's just cut that down to 10, and then we'll dump in some fossil fuel plants. We can go to 11. And I can just kind of play with numbers here, and what I'm trying to do is just barely meet my demand. And any money that I don't spend actually stays within my budget and rolls over to a subsequent round. So it's a good thing to try to leave money here in your budget. So this is a perfectly appropriate set of power plants that I can build to meet my short-term energy goals. Now let's talk about how to optimize your energy infrastructure to meet your long-term goals. Long-term goals are the other face of this activity that is important for you to consider. So you have to meet your short-term goals, and they're pretty objective. Either you have a red X or you have a green check mark, and so you know if you've met your short-term goals. Long-term goals are not quite as obvious. So there are 3 types. There's emissions, there's security, and there's profit. Emissions refers to carbon emissions, and this is kind of how we're going to think about the environmental consequences. High carbon emissions are bad, low carbon emissions are better. Profit is a little easier to understand. This is the amount of money that your energy company is making based on the electricity that you're selling. The more money you make, the more you have access to resources to work with. And so it's good to maximize your profits. The default is that your company is going to make $16.26 billion per round. Your budget for round one is going to be whatever your profits are plus any money that you didn't spend in round zero. So as this simulation progresses, people typically end up with a larger and larger budget. The money just kind of builds and they have to do more things with it. So emissions need to come down, profits need to go up. Your security score that you have, this is kind of arbitrary, it's not very well defined, but it's basically asking the question, how long can you continue to do the thing that you're doing without creating massive problems? And so different power plants have different security impacts. And those are spelled out right here in this security block. So the security score that you have at round zero when the activity starts is 14.13. And that number is kind of arbitrary. It's just to think about it as that's a baseline. That's where you're starting. And you want your security to go up. Each different type of power plant has a different individual security score. So the security score from nuclear power plants is 0. And you may disagree with that kind of on ideological principles, but it's just the number that I've assigned to the activity. And the rationale is that nuclear power, we don't really have a plan in the United States, a good plan for storing waste nuclear fuel. So for that reason, I've given nuclear power a score of 0. Fossil fuel security, we have a lot of coal. We could eat coal and be fine. It has some environmental consequences, but in terms of how long can we continue to do the thing we're doing, we can do fossil fuels for a while. And so the fossil fuel security of electricity is very high. It's a 40. Renewable energy security is also high, and again, this is kind of an arbitrary number because there's so many different types of renewable energy. So it's 30. Oil security is a -10, and this is actually based on when I built this simulation prior to the shale revolution, when the United States was importing all of its oil. And I'm going to leave that number alone for the time being, so you're going to have to work with it. But oil security as a -10 means that oil is significantly hurting your security score. And the oil is down here. It's not part of your electricity grid, rather this is transportation fuel. And manipulating the oil is something that you're going to have to spend some time thinking about when we have a future round with more yellow boxes. Currently, the only yellow boxes you have are your name and the number of power plants, and none of those will directly affect oil. So even though oil is a big problem and it has a large negative impact on your security, it's not a problem that you're allowed to address at this point in the simulation. So just kind of put it to the side. The security is the sum of the individual security of these 4 different types of energy. Nuclear starts at a 0. Fossil fuel is this 40 times the percentage of your power that actually comes from fossil fuel to give me a score of 26.8. Renewable security is the 30 security score times the percentage, and then oil is the million barrels per day that you're consuming times the security score, and I add these together. So if you want to improve your security score, you want to build things, power plants, that have a security score that's going to be higher than 14.13. So if we build a single renewable energy plant and then I hit enter, the security score went from 14.13 to 14.19. And so the more of our energy grid currently that we place in fossil fuels, the more secure that energy grid becomes. But burning fossil fuels produces emissions. So let's go up here and look at the emissions factors. So our total emissions that we're producing in round 0 are 405.56. Remember, emissions are bad in this simulation, and probably in real life that's a fair statement. So if you build an additional coal-fired power plant, then this 405.56 is going to go up to 407.56. So while it helps your security to build more fossil fuel power plants, it hurts your emissions. So now you have to deal with balancing and trading off between pros and cons. And that's really kind of at the heart and soul of this simulation. Emissions come from three different sources. We have fossil fuel power plants produce the bulk of our emissions. Oil produces another significant amount of emissions, and nearly the other 50%. And then other has to do with actually a small amount of emissions that are associated with some types of renewable energy. And I also have that as a category. It makes it easier for me to do some calculations. So for now, just think about this as the minor impacts of other types of power production. Primarily hydroelectric power dams actually produce some some carbon emissions because they change the way that matter can decompose in a river versus a lake. That's mostly where that calculation is coming from. Okay, so if I build fossil fuel power plants, let's build 2 of them, then my emissions will creep up, and that's bad. But your security goes up, which is good. So we have to decide which of those 2 we need to value. Finally, let's look at profits. Now, this is, again, an oversimplified view of a real-world issue that not all types of energy production are going to give you the same profit margin. And I've done this calculation in probably the most simplest way possible. I simply state that each power plant results in a certain percentage of money that stays in your pocket. For nuclear power plants, 50% of the electricity sales are profit, and the other 50% go into maintenance. So you make half of the money that you get, you keep it. You keep half of the money that you make selling nuclear electricity. For fossil fuels, it's slightly lower, which is a bad thing. So you only make about 45% of the dollars of electricity that you sell. And renewable profits are really bad. You only make 20% of the dollars that you sell. So this $16.26 billion that you have in profit is a function of the percentage, as well as how much of your energy is actually coming from fossil fuel. So even though nuclear is slightly more profitable, there's just so much less nuclear power on your grid that you don't end up making as much money as you certainly would from fossil fuels, which are the bulk of your electricity grid. And finally, we're going to set a price. This is 11 cents per kilowatt hour. That's kind of where the United States is right now. I built these numbers in 10 years ago, and I'm not that motivated to update them because it's a mess on a programming side. So it's 11 cents. You can actually modify the price that you charge later on in the activity, and that's one of the ways the students will increase their profits is simply by jacking up prices. So if nuclear energy is a more profitable type of energy, then if you look at the profits, the 16.26, and I build a nuclear power plant, it makes more money. And partly it makes more money because now you're selling more energy. If we build a second one, we continue to see profits rise. If you build a third one, your profits rise. And then when you build a fourth one, your profits only slightly go up because of how it changes the percentage distribution. But at this point, though, you're wasting a unit of energy that nobody's going to buy, and so it's not a good idea from a profit incentive to try to overproduce the energy. Okay, so now you have kind of a much more complicated system of options to look at. And usually what I try to have students do in round 0A during class time is to have each group member come up with a different array of power plants that allows them to meet their short-term goals, and then have the group members compare their decisions over here on the long-term goals. Now, how do your long-term goals affect your assessment, your grade, or how good your group is? We won't know that until we compare your long-term goals with other groups' long-term goals in the class, and that's going to happen in round 0B. So don't worry about that for now. What I would do now is sit down with your group, try to come up with different arrays of power plant production that you can build, and then try to decide as a group which one of those different options or different portfolios of electricity production maximizes your profits. You want that to be high, increases your security, and results in the lowest emissions. In round 0, there's no way for you to get your emissions down to 0. You just want to try to get as low as possible. And really, there's not a way yet for you to get away with your short-term goals without building at least some fossil fuel power plants. So all of you in your different members of group are going to end up with an arrangement of power facilities that's going to cause this to be higher than 405.56, and that's fine. There's no way to avoid that. But you want to try to figure out how can I get it as close to 405.56 as possible while also maximizing my security and maximizing my profit. So try some numbers, see what you can come up with, and then I'll hopefully be able to come back with a video for 0B that shows you now how to make some better decisions and have more options at your disposal.